He defined an era of American cinema with a single, uncompromising squint. The man with no name who conquered the brutal West, the relentless detective who cleaned up the streets, and the towering director who bent Hollywood to his quiet will. The world knew his gravelly voice, his iron posture, and his uncanny ability to make absolute toughness look effortless. But there's a truth the cameras never fully captured. Behind the billions in box office and the shelf of Academy Awards stands a man forced to pay a profound price for his own mythology, a boy of the Great Depression who moved from town to town, learning early that silence was his only reliable shield, a father who spent a lifetime searching for connection, leaving behind a complex, fractured trail of relationships and 8 children who had to share him with the world. A 95-year-old survivor who now walks onto movie sets populated by ghosts, having said agonizing goodbyes to almost every friend, rival, and contemporary he ever knew. Clint Eastwood's life carries a quiet sorrow that classic westerns rarely show. How does a man who built his legacy playing the invincible lone wolf handle the freezing reality of actually being the last one standing? Why does a 95-year-old legend with nothing left to prove refuse to leave the director's chair, working relentlessly instead of resting in the empire he built? And what is the heartbreaking cost of wearing a mask of absolute, unbreakable strength for an entire lifetime? Before we answer these questions, we must go back to the beginning. To understand the legend, you must first know the boy who never had a place to call home. The boy with no roots in the armor of silence. There's a profound, enduring myth about the men who become icons of American toughness. We like to believe they were born invincible. We like to imagine that they arrived in this world already forged in steel, ready to stare down the horizon without blinking. But true resilience is never inherited. It is earned. It is carved out of necessity, shaped by scarcity, and hammered into existence by the relentless, unpredictable anvil of life. To understand Clint Eastwood, the man who is still like an immovable mountain at the center of American cinema for over 6 decades, you cannot start with the flashing cameras of Hollywood. You cannot start with the tailored suits, the global adoration, or the billions of dollars in box office triumphs. You must start in the dust. You must start in the shadows of the Great Depression. Clint Eastwood Jr. was born on May 31st, 1930, in San Francisco, California. He arrived at the exact moment the American economy was fundamentally fracturing. The roaring 20s had collapsed into a terrifying silence, leaving millions of families staring into an abyss of uncertainty. The Eastwood family was not immune to this sudden, sweeping devastation. His father, Clinton Sr., was a deeply proud, hard-working man, a man who believed that providing for his family was the absolute, non-negotiable definition of his existence. But in the 1930s, pride could not buy groceries, and loyalty could not keep a job that simply no longer existed. And so, the Eastwood family became nomads of necessity. Throughout Clint's childhood, the family moved with a heartbreaking frequency. They packed whatever they owned into the back of a tired automobile and drove across the sprawling landscapes of the West Coast, chasing rumors of work. From Piedmont to Oakland, from Sacramento to Pacific Palisades, they lived a life defined entirely by transience. For a young boy, this kind of existence carries a very specific, invisible psychological weight. Imagine what it feels like to constantly be the new kid in town. Every few months, Clint had to walk into a strange classroom, wearing clothes he had worn 100 times before, and face the scrutinizing stares of children who had known each other since birth. He had to navigate the intricate, often cruel social hierarchies of the schoolyard, only to be uprooted just as he was finally beginning to understand the rules. When you're forced to say goodbye that many times before you're even 10 years old, you quickly learn a crucial lesson about human connection. Impermanence is the only guarantee. You learn that putting down roots is a dangerous investment because the soil will inevitably be pulled out from under you. So, the young boy made a quiet, subconscious decision. He stopped trying to plant roots in the ground, and he began to build a fortress inside himself. He learned to observe rather than participate. He learned that speaking too much only invited unwanted attention. he discovered that a steady, impenetrable silence was a far better shield than any argument. That iconic, menacing squint, the look that would one day make outlaws tremble on the silver screen, was not born in a Hollywood acting class. It was born in the passenger seat of a moving car, squinting into the harsh California sun, watching another town disappear in a rear-view mirror, bracing himself for whatever unknown struggle lay ahead. He became the man with no name long before a script ever demanded it of him, simply because he was a boy who never truly had a hometown. But this transit life did not break his spirit. It forged his incredible work ethic. From watching his father endure the humiliations of the Depression without ever surrendering his dignity, Clint absorbed profound respect for the sheer nobility of hard labor. As a teenager, he did not dream of red carpets or applause. He dreamed of a steady paycheck. He took on jobs that demanded physical exhaustion. He baled hay under the blistering sun. He drove logging trucks down treacherous mountain roads. He worked as a lumberjack, feeling the rough bark of the trees and the ache in his muscles, learning the undeniable value of a day's sweat. He was not bred for the velvet ropes of high society. He was shaped by the dirt, the sawdust, and the quiet dignity of the American working class. He learned that action always speaks louder than words, a philosophy that would become the very foundation of his entire cinematic legacy. In 1951, as the Korean War raged across the Pacific, Clint was drafted into the United States Army. He was stationed at Fort Ord in California, serving as a swimming instructor. It seemed like a relatively safe assignment, a quiet chapter in a life that had finally stopped moving so frantically. But destiny has a terrifying way of testing the strength of the armor we build. In the late autumn of 1951, Clint was hitching a ride aboard a Douglas AD bomber, returning to his base after visiting his family in Seattle. As the aircraft flew over the treacherous waters off the coast of Northern California, deep in the heavy, suffocating fog, the unthinkable happened. The plane's engine suddenly failed. The heavy machine plummeted from the sky, crashing violently into the freezing, turbulent waters of the Pacific Ocean, several miles off the jagged coast of Point Reyes. It was a moment of absolute, terrifying clarity. The aircraft began to sink into the dark, icy depths. For a 21-year-old young man, plunging into freezing ocean miles from shore, panic would have been the most natural, expected human response. Many men would have frozen. Many men would have surrendered to the terrifying vastness of the sea. But Clint Eastwood did not panic. The boy who had spent his entire life learning how to survive simply adjusted to his new reality. He and the pilot escaped the sinking wreckage and found themselves alone in the freezing, churning ocean. The shore was miles away, hidden behind a thick wall of fog. The water temperature was cold enough to induce hypothermia within minutes. But Clint looked toward where he believed the land was, and he began to swim. For hours, he fought against the massive, unforgiving swells of the Pacific. He swam through dense, dragging beds of kelp that wrapped around his legs like desperate hands trying to pull him under. His muscles screamed in agony. The cold seeped into his bones, threatening to shut his body down completely. The darkness of the ocean was absolute, and the silence was deafening. Yet, he kept moving, stroke by agonizing stroke. He refused to let the ocean win. He refused to let the story end in the dark. When he finally dragged his battered, exhausted body onto the rocky shores of California, collapsing in the mud and the salt, he had survived a trial that would have broken almost anyone else. It was a quiet, brutal, and incredibly profound testament to his will to live. That long, agonizing swim to the dark waters of the Pacific is perhaps the most perfect metaphor for Clint Eastwood's entire existence. Whenever life threw him into the deep end, whenever conditions were freezing, dark, and utterly impossible, he never waited for a rescue boat. He never complained about the temperature of the water. He just put his head down, and he swam until he found solid ground. When his military service ended, he found himself drifting towards Los Angeles, not with a burning, desperate ambition to become a famous actor, but simply because he heard the studios paid decent money for tall, good-looking young men to stand in the background of movies. He enrolled in Los Angeles City College, studying business administration, treating acting auditions as just another blue-collar job to pay the rent. In 1954, he walked onto the lot of Universal Studios. He was 24 years old, standing 6'4", possessing a striking, ruggedly handsome face, and carrying that deep, impenetrable silence he had perfected as a child. He thought his armor was flawless. He thought his ability to endure the hard labor of the world had prepared him for anything. But as he stepped into the glittering, ruthless, and highly artificial machinery of the Hollywood studio system, the young survivor from the Great Depression was about to face a completely different kind of rejection. The industry did not see a resilient survivor. They did not see the quiet dignity of a man who had conquered the freezing Pacific. They looked at the boy who had never had a hometown, and they told him, in no uncertain terms, that he did not belong here either. The legendary mask that would one day conquer the globe was about to be flatly, brutally rejected by the very world he was destined to rule. The Mask, the Squint, and the Golden Cage. In the mid-1950s, the Hollywood studio system was an immaculate, highly controlled factory of dreams. It was a machine designed to manufacture a very specific kind of leading man. The industry demanded actors who were polished, articulate, and theatrical. They wanted men who commanded a room with loud, booming voices, perfectly combed hair, and smiles that could sell toothpaste, and a vision of suburban American perfection. Clint Eastwood was none of those things. He was not polished. He was carved from the rough, splintered wood of the Great Depression. He did not possess a theatrical, booming voice, because he had spent his entire childhood learning that silence was the safest place to hide. When he signed his first modest contract with Universal Studios in 1954, he assumed that his willingness to work hard, to show up early, learn his lines, and put in the physical labor would be enough. He had survived the freezing, turbulent waters of the Pacific Ocean. He had survived the grueling exhaustion of the logging camps. Surely, standing in front of the camera and pretending to be someone else would be simple by comparison. But Hollywood does not judge a man by the strength of his character or the endurance of his spirit. Hollywood judges a man by the geometry of his face. The studio executives brought the young, 24-year-old Eastwood into their offices and subjected him to the kind of clinical, degrading scrutiny that breaks the confidence of even the strongest men. They looked at the 6'4" survivor and simply shook their heads. They told him his Adam's apple protruded too much, making him look awkward. They told him he had a chipped tooth that ruined his profile. They criticized his posture, claiming he looked as stiff as a telephone pole. But their harshest criticism was reserved for his voice. They told him he spoke far too slowly. He delivered his lines through clenched teeth, murmuring his dialogue as if he was reluctant to share the words. They demanded that he speak up, project his voice, and act like a traditional star. When Clint could not naturally conform to their rigid, artificial mold, they unceremoniously fired him. They looked at the man who would one day become the undisputed icon of American cinema, and they told him he simply did not have what it takes. For a young man who had grown up drifting from town to town, constantly searching for a place to belong, this rejection was a deeply familiar, agonizing sting. He was an outsider once again, cast out of the studio gates. He returned to the blue-collar reality that had always sustained him. He dug swimming pools in the blinding California heat. He managed an apartment building. He did whatever he had to do to survive, treating acting not as a grand artistic pursuit, but simply as a job he had briefly tried and failed at. Eventually, television offered him a lifeline. In 1959, he was cast as Rowdy Yates, a boyish, impetuous young cowboy in the Western series Rawhide. The show was a tremendous success, running for over 200 episodes, and it finally provided Clint with the financial stability he had craved since childhood. But Rawhide quickly became a velvet prison. The character of Rowdy Yates was naive, clean-cut, and perpetually eager to please. He was a television cowboy, sanitized for family viewing. As the years dragged on, Clint felt an unbearable, suffocating frustration. He was a man in his 30s who had known the bitter taste of poverty, the harshness of physical labor, and the freezing embrace of near death, yet he was forced to play an innocent boy on screen. He felt an overwhelming urge to portray a character who actually understood the dark, unforgiving reality of the world he knew. He was desperate to peel back the polished veneer of the American West and expose the dust, the sweat, and the moral ambiguity beneath it. In 1964, a strange, incredibly risky opportunity arrived in the mail. It was a script for a low-budget, unofficial remake of a Japanese samurai film, to be shot not in Hollywood, but in the desolate, sun-baked deserts of Almeria, Spain. It was being directed by an Italian filmmaker named Sergio Leone, who spoke almost no English. Every established actor in Hollywood had passed on the project. It was considered a massive career gamble, a fast track to absolute obscurity. But Clint Eastwood was tired of playing by Hollywood's rules. He was tired of being told to smile, to speak up, to be the good boy. He accepted the paltry salary, packed a single suitcase, and boarded a plane to Europe, leaving the golden cage of American television behind. He was walking into the wilderness, and in that wilderness, he was about to forge the most famous mask in the history of film. When Clint arrived in Spain, he realized the production was chaotic, underfunded, and wonderfully free from the suffocating oversight of studio executives. Sergio Leone did not want a traditional, talkative hero. He wanted an apparition. He wanted a ghost. Clint took it upon himself to build the character from the ground up. Before leaving America, he had gone to a wardrobe store in Santa Monica and purchased a pair of black jeans, a faded blue shirt, and a sheepskin vest. He bought a battered, brown felt hat. He found a dark, heavily patterned poncho that he refused to wash, allowing the dust and the grime of the Spanish desert to settle deep into the wool. And finally, he went to a local store and bought a box of cheap, foul-tasting cigars. Clint Eastwood was a lifelong non-smoker who absolutely detested the taste of tobacco, but he knew the character needed an anchor. He stepped out into the blinding, brutal heat of the Tabernas Desert, and the transformation began. The Spanish sun was agonizingly bright. To protect his eyes, Clint naturally narrowed them into a tight, focused glare. But that squint quickly became something much more profound than a physical reaction to the light. It became a psychological shield. By narrowing his eyes, he was effectively closing the windows to his soul. He was making himself entirely unreadable, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying mystery. And then, he made a decision that completely revolutionized the art of screen acting. He took his script, took out a pen, and began crossing out his own dialogue. In an industry where actors constantly fought for more lines, Clint deliberately stripped his words away. He remembered the criticism from the Universal executives years ago, that he spoke too slowly, too quietly, in the Spanish desert. He weaponized that very criticism. He chewed on the bitter cigar, keeping his jaw tightly clenched, and he reduced his dialogue to a raspy, barely audible whisper. He realized a profound psychological truth. The less he spoke, the more the audience would be forced to lean in. The quieter he became, the louder his presence echoed across the screen. He took the profound silence of his lonely, drifting childhood, the silence he had used to protect himself as the eternal new kid in school, and he turned it into the ultimate cinematic weapon. When A Fistful of Dollars was released, followed by For a Few Dollars More in the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the impact was seismic. The film shattered the traditional mythology of the noble, white-hatted American cowboy. Clint's man with no name was cynical, self-serving, and ruthlessly efficient. He didn't ride into town to save the day out of the goodness of his heart. He did it for the gold. The global audience was absolutely mesmerized. They had never seen anything like him. The man who had been fired for looking like a stiff telephone pole with a prominent Adam's apple was suddenly the most recognizable, imitated, and worshipped masculine archetype on the planet. He returned to the United States not just as a star, but as a cinematic god. He had conquered the very industry that had once humiliated him, and he had done it entirely on his own terms, by breaking every single rule they had tried to force upon him. It was the ultimate triumph for the underdog. It was a spectacular, deeply satisfying revenge against the superficial machinery of Hollywood. But profound, quiet tragedy was secretly taking root beneath the surface of this massive victory. Clint Eastwood had created a masterpiece of a mask. The poncho, the cigar, the squint, and the whispered growl were meticulously crafted armor. But the world fell so deeply, so passionately in love with the mask that they demanded he never, ever take it off. They did not want the sensitive, hard-working boy from San Francisco. They did not want the man who appreciated jazz music, who played the piano, and who possessed a deep, introspective intellect. They wanted the Phantom. They wanted the icy, invincible killer who needed absolutely no one, who never showed a fraction of vulnerability, and who solved every complex problem of human existence with the swift, decisive pull of a trigger. For a man who had already spent his entire life struggling to establish deep emotional roots, being universally worshipped for being emotionally detached was a remarkably dangerous triumph. The mask was glued to his face. The legend was permanently cast in stone. And as the 1960s faded into the chaotic, violent dawn of the 1970s, Clint was about to trade his Western six-shooter for a .44 Magnum, stepping into a role that would make him the biggest star in the world, and in the process, trap his soul in a fortress so impenetrable, even the people who loved him most would struggle to find the man inside. The Magnum, the master, and the empire of dust. Hollywood is an industry that loves a comeback story, but it prefers comebacks that come with apologies. It wants actors to return with a humble bow, grateful for a second chance. But when Clint Eastwood returned to America after a spectacular, world-altering success in the Italian deserts, he did not come back to ask for permission to be a star. He came back to conquer. The boy who had been fired for speaking too quietly, the actor who had been told his Adam's apple was too prominent, had returned as the most bankable, magnetic presence in global cinema. He did not change his style to fit Hollywood. He forced Hollywood to bend his style. The 1960s had belonged to a man with no name, but as the 1970s dawned, a new era of American anxiety required a new kind of cinematic titan. In 1971, the world was introduced to Inspector Harry Callahan in the gritty, relentless masterpiece Dirty Harry. The film captured a fractured, cynical zeitgeist in America struggling with rising crime and a collapsing sense of order. When Clint stepped onto the sun-scorched streets of San Francisco, carrying that massive .44 Magnum hand cannon, he wasn't just playing a cop. He was channeling the profound frustration of the silent majority. With his tailored tweed jackets, his wraparound sunglasses, and a terrifying, ice-cold calm, he redefined the modern action hero. When he leveled that massive revolver at a bank robber and delivered the iconic whispered monologue, you gotta ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do ya, punk? The entire culture shifted on its axis. He was no longer just an actor. He was a monument of American masculinity. He was the unstoppable force. He was the immovable object. But this is where the story of Clint Eastwood diverges from the predictable path of traditional movie stars. Most actors who achieve that level of godlike stardom allow themselves to be coddled. They buy the mansions, attend the lavish parties, and surround themselves with managers and agents who dictate their every move. They become comfortable inside the golden cage. Clint Eastwood looked at the golden cage, and he decided to buy the factory that made it. He had never forgotten the humiliating lesson he learned as a young man in the offices of Universal Studios. If you do not own your work, you do not own your life. If you leave your fate in the hands of executives in suits, they will eventually discard you. Clint did not want to be an employee of the Hollywood machine. He wanted to be the architect. In a move of absolute, brilliant defiance, he formed his own production company, Malpaso Productions. It was a staggering assertion of autonomy. By creating Malpaso, Clint took complete financial and creative control over his destiny. He was no longer waiting for the phone to ring. He was the one making the calls. He chose the scripts. He hired the crew. He dictated the budgets. He built an empire entirely on his own terms, fundamentally rejecting the bloated, wasteful, and chaotic traditions of the Hollywood studio system. It is here that we must truly celebrate the magnificent blue-collar work ethic that Clint had forged during the Great Depression. He did not run his production company like a pampered celebrity. He ran it like a master carpenter running a construction site. On an Eastwood set, there was no screaming. There was no chaos, no egos throwing tantrums in trailers, and absolutely no wasted time. Clint respected the crew, the electricians, the camera operators, the stuntmen, far more than he respected the executives. He understood the value of a hard day's work. He brought his films in under budget and ahead of schedule, an unheard of feat in modern Hollywood. In fact, his directing style became the stuff of absolute legend. Clint Eastwood does not yell action because he believes it startles the actors and breaks the natural rhythm of the moment. Instead, he simply nods, leans in, and whispers, "Go ahead." And when the scene is over, he does not yell cut. He softly says, "That's enough." This quiet, masterful precision is the true essence of his genius. He took the silence that had once been his armor as a lonely, drifting child, and he transformed it into the ultimate tool of leadership. When a man speaks quietly, it forces everyone else in the room to stop talking and listen. On his sets, his authority was absolute, not because he demanded fear, but because he commanded profound, unspoken respect. In 1971, the same year Dirty Harry shattered box office records, Clint made the most crucial pivot of his entire artistic life. He stepped behind the camera to make his directorial debut with the psychological thriller play Misty for Me. This was a profound declaration of intent. He did not just want to be the guy holding the gun. He wanted to be the storyteller. He wanted to explore jazz music, complex psychology, and the dark, nuanced corners of the human condition that his tough guy image rarely allowed him to show. Over the next 5 decades, the director's chair would become his truest sanctuary. It was a place where the legendary Squint faded and the brilliant, deeply sensitive artist emerged. But the pursuit of absolute mastery always exacts a toll. Excellence is a jealous master, and building a cinematic empire requires sacrifices that most men are unwilling to make. For Clint, the movie set became his truest home. The crew members of Malpaso, many of whom worked with him for 30, 40, even 50 years, became his most consistent family. The intoxicating rhythm of scouting locations, setting up shots, and editing film in the quiet, dark rooms of the studio became the oxygen his soul required to breathe. To achieve this level of unprecedented, prolific greatness, directing and starring in dozens of masterpieces across half a century, he had to exist in a state of perpetual forward motion. The boy who had spent his childhood moving from town to town had grown into a man who simply could not stop working. This relentless drive is worthy of the highest admiration. It is a hallmark of a true titan, a man who refused to rest on his laurels, who pushed his creative boundaries long after his contemporaries had retired to the golf course. He gave the world an unparalleled library of cinematic treasures, but a life dedicated so absolutely, so fiercely to the camera, inevitably leaves a different kind of footprint in the private dust behind the lens. A man who gives 90% of his heart to his art has only 10% left for the real world. As he built his magnificent, unassailable empire of light and shadow, his personal life, the quiet, ordinary life of marriages and children, would inevitably struggle to survive in the massive, overwhelming shade of his greatness. He was the undisputed king of Hollywood. He had conquered the executives, mastered the craft, and secured his immortality. But as the decades rolled on, the ultimate lone wolf was about to discover that while you can direct every single frame of a movie, you can never truly yell cut on the complexities of the human heart. The Reckoning, the masterpiece, and the Maestro. There's an unspoken, terrifying law in the machinery of Hollywood. The industry does not allow its heroes to age with dignity. As the years pass and the golden boys inevitably grow older, the studios demand that they fight a desperate, humiliating war against time. Actors are encouraged to dye their hair, undergo surgeries, and pretend that the clock has somehow stopped, all to preserve the illusion of eternal, unbroken youth. But Clint Eastwood, a man forged in the harsh realities of the Great Depression, fundamentally rejected this artificial war. He did not hide his wrinkles. He did not erase the gray from his hair. Instead, He allowed the deep, rugged canyons of time to carve themselves permanently into his face. He wore his age not as a burden, but as a map of his survival. He understood a profound truth that most of his contemporaries missed. The most compelling stories are not told by the flawless faces of the young, but by the weathered, exhausted eyes of those who have actually lived. As the 1980s drew to a close and the 1990s began, Clint was approaching his early 60s. He had spent 3 decades defining American cinema through the barrel of a gun. He was the man with no name. He was Dirty Harry. He had made millions of dollars and entertained billions of people by portraying men who solved the complex, agonizing problems of the world with absolute, unfeeling swiftness. But a profound philosophical shift was quietly taking place inside the director's mind. For years, Clint had held on to a particular script. It was a dark, unromantic, and deeply uncompromising Western. It had been sitting in his desk drawer for nearly a decade. He had deliberately refused to make the film in his 50s, telling his trusted producers that he needed to wait. He needed his face to accumulate more history. He needed his bones to ache just a little bit more. He needed to be old enough to truly understand the heavy, unforgiving gravity of regret. In 1992, at the age of 62, he decided it was finally time. He stepped into the director's chair and in front of the camera to make his defining masterpiece, Unforgiven. To understand the sheer, breathtaking genius of Unforgiven, you must understand what Clint Eastwood was doing to his own legacy. For his entire career, he had popularized the myth of the noble gunfighter, the idea that drawing a weapon was a clean, righteous, and heroic act. But with this film, he systematically, ruthlessly tore that myth down. He cast himself as William Money, an aging, impoverished pig farmer and a widower, struggling to raise his children in the mud. Money was not a hero. He was a man haunted by a dark, terrible past, tortured by the memories of the lives he had taken when he was young, drunk, and reckless. When Clint's character finally picks up a weapon again, there is no triumphant music. There is no glorious, slow-motion victory. Instead, the film delivers a devastating meditation on the true, horrifying cost of violence. In one of the most profound lines ever spoken on the silver screen, his character looks into the eyes of a dying man and whispers, "It's a hell of a thing, taking a man's life. You take away all he's got and all he's ever going to have." This was not just dialogue. This was an older, wiser Clint Eastwood speaking directly to his audience and directly to his own cinematic past. It was a cinematic confession. He was stripping the romance away from the Western genre, showing the world that taking a life does not make you a god. It leaves a permanent, rotting hole in your soul. He showed that violence is not a slick, entertaining spectacle, but a messy, tragic failure of humanity that stains everyone involved. It takes an unimaginable level of artistic courage for a man to look at the very foundation of his billionaire empire, examine the archetype that made him an immortal legend, and say to the world, "We were wrong to glorify this." When Unforgiven was released, it did not just succeed at the box office. It struck the culture like a bolt of lightning. Critics and audiences sat in darkened theaters in absolute, stunned silence. They realized they were not just watching a Western. They were watching a profound American tragedy, directed by a man who had completely mastered his craft. In the spring of 1993, the Hollywood establishment, the same establishment that had fired him in the 1950s for speaking too slowly and having a prominent Adam's apple, was forced about his absolute supremacy. At the Academy Awards, Unforgiven won Best Picture, and Clint Eastwood walked onto the stage to accept the Oscar for Best Director. It was the ultimate, undeniable vindication. He had not just survived the industry, he had transcended it. He had elevated the popcorn entertainment of his youth into high art. He had become a maestro. And the word maestro is not used lightly here, because behind the rugged, tough guy exterior of the iconic director lies a secret that often surprises even his most devoted fans. Clint Eastwood is a phenomenally talented musician. He does not just direct the cameras and the actors. He frequently composes the musical scores for his own films. The boy who grew up in the Great Depression had found a deep, abiding love for jazz and the piano. When the chaotic energy of a movie set finally wraps the day, Clint will often sit alone in a quiet room, his massive, weather hands gently resting on the black and white keys of the piano. He writes melodies that are stripped down, haunting, and incredibly tender. The main acoustic guitar theme for Unforgiven? He wrote it. The beautiful, melancholic piano score for $1 Million Baby? He composed it. He understands that the most powerful emotions in cinema are not found in the explosions or the dialogue, but in the quiet, resonant spaces between the notes. This is the magnificent, brilliant duality of Clint Eastwood. He is a man who can command a set of 500 people with a single whispered instruction, yet he is also a sensitive artist who can break your heart with 4 simple chords on a piano. Throughout his 60s and into his 70s, the director's chair became his absolute sanctuary. It was the one place on earth where the world made perfect sense. As a director, he was the architect of reality. He could control the lighting. He could control the narrative. He could create worlds where justice, however flawed, was eventually served, and where the complex moral gray areas of the human condition could be safely explored. He was incredibly prolific, moving seamlessly from deeply romantic tragedies like The Bridges of Madison County to profound, heartbreaking meditations on family and loss like Mystic River and $1 Million Baby. He was working at a pace that left directors half his age completely exhausted. He was nominated for Oscars, he won Oscars, and he was celebrated as the greatest living American filmmaker. He had achieved a level of professional perfection that is almost historically unprecedented. He was a titan, a living monument to the power of relentless dedication and artistic evolution. But life, in its infinite complexity, demands a balance. A man cannot exist entirely within the perfectly framed, meticulously controlled boundaries of a camera lens. Eventually, the director must yell, "Cut!" turn off the studio lights, and drive home. And it was in the messy, unpredictable, and entirely unscripted reality of his personal life that the great Maestro struggled to maintain control. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of storytelling on screen, but off-screen, his heart was a restless, wandering compass. As he built a cinematic legacy that will outlast us all, he was simultaneously leaving behind a complex, sprawling, and deeply fractured trail of relationships. The man who could beautifully orchestrate the emotions of millions of strangers in a movie theater found himself repeatedly struggling to navigate the intimate, quiet demands of his own living room. The supreme architect of Hollywood was about to face the undeniable, chaotic consequences of a lifetime spent searching for love, while being entirely married to his work. The fractured tribe and the quest for forgiveness. There is a fundamental, uncompromising difference between the art of directing a film and the art of directing a life. On a movie set, a director possesses the power of absolute geometry. If a scene is broken, he simply rewrites the dialogue. If an actor walks out of frame, he calls them back. If a moment fails to capture the necessary emotion, he can roll the camera again and demand a second take. In the dark, controlled sanctuary of the editing room, all mistakes can be meticulously cut, swept onto the floor, and forgotten forever. But life outside the studio gates offers no such luxury. Life is a relentless, unscripted single take. It is messy, overlapping, and utterly immune to the word cut. For a man who spent his entire existence demanding absolute perfection within the borders of a camera lens, the sprawling, unpredictable borders of his own home proved to be a far more difficult landscape to master. To understand the immensely complex personal life of Clint Eastwood, we must briefly look back at the frightened, transient boy from the Great Depression. Remember that he grew up in the passenger seat of a moving car, learning early that towns, schools, and friends were all temporary. When a child learns that roots are easily torn from the earth, he naturally develops a restless heart. He becomes a man who is always looking toward the next horizon, convinced that stillness is simply another word for vulnerability. As Clint built his magnificent, unassailable empire in Hollywood, his romantic life reflected the chaotic, restless compass of a man who never truly learned how to stay in one place. Across several decades, through 2 official marriages and a series of long-term, quietly intense relationships, Clint fathered 8 children with 6 different women. In the ruthless, superficial pages of tabloid magazines, an unconventional family tree of this magnitude is often reduced to scandalous headlines. But tabloids do not understand the profound, aching complexities of the human heart. They do not understand the agonizing math of being a visionary artist. The truth is, for a very long time, Clint Eastwood was married primarily to the cinema. The movie set was his truest home, and the crew was his most consistent family. To produce the sheer volume of masterpieces he gifted the world, he had to give the absolute best hours of his day, the sharpest focus of his mind, and the deepest reserves of his emotional energy to the camera. But when a man pours 90% of his soul into a fictional universe, he leaves only an exhausted, hollowed-out remnant for the people waiting in his living room. For many years, Clint was the archetype of the absent, larger-than-life father. His children grew up in the massive, intimidating shadow of an American god. They had to watch their father ride across the plains on massive silver screens, projecting an image of invincible protection to billions of strangers, while they simultaneously navigated the quiet, ordinary challenges of childhood without him. There were missed birthdays, delayed holidays, and inevitable, painful fractures that occur when a father's schedule is dictated by the relentless demands of a film studio. This is the secret, heavy toll of legendary greatness. A man cannot be a titan of industry and a perfectly present patriarch at the exact same time. The scale always tips. The pursuit of immortality invariably requires the sacrifice of the present moment. But time has a beautiful, merciless way of softening even the hardest stones. As Clint Eastwood crossed the threshold of his 70s, navigated through his 80s, and approached his profound 90s, a magnificent transformation began to unfold. The legendary Squint softened. The icy, unapproachable exterior of Inspector Harry Callahan and the man with no name slowly melted away, revealing a profoundly thoughtful, deeply introspective patriarch. Age forces every man to look back at the tapestry he has woven. And when Clint looked at the sprawling, complex, and beautiful array of children he had brought into the world, Kimber, Kyle, Allison, Scott, Catherine, Francesca, Morgan, and his eldest daughter, Lori, whose existence was a quiet revelation later in his life. He did not make excuses. He did not attempt to rewrite the past with the arrogance of a Hollywood director. Instead, he did something far more courageous. He began the quiet, lifelong work of gathering his tribe. He realized that while he could not rewind the clock and be the father they needed when they were young, he could absolutely be the patriarch they deserved in his twilight years. He began to intentionally, deliberately pull his fractured family together. He invited them into his world, blurring the lines between his cinematic empire and his bloodline. If you look closely at his later films, you will see a beautiful, subtle act of fatherly integration. His son Kyle, an incredibly talented jazz musician, became a frequent composer for his father's films, providing the gorgeous, haunting bass lines that anchor Clint's later masterpieces. His son Scott, possessing an uncanny, almost breathtaking resemblance to his father's younger self, began appearing in his movies and forging his own path. His daughters found roles in his productions, on his crews, and in the quiet, creative spaces of his life. He used the very medium that had once kept him away from them as the bridge to bring them back. The red carpets, which were once the exclusive domain of the solitary, untouchable superstar, completely transformed. When Clint Eastwood arrives at a premiere today, he does not walk alone. He is surrounded by a massive, smiling, fiercely loyal phalanx of children and grandchildren. They stand shoulder to shoulder, a remarkably united front, a beautiful, living mosaic of his long, complicated journey. He achieved something in his later years that many billionaires and legends completely failed to accomplish. He found forgiveness, and he built a genuine family. There is a breathtaking dignity in watching a man who was once universally feared for his cinematic toughness become a gentle, deeply beloved grandfather. It requires a profound vulnerability to admit that the greatest legacy a man can leave behind is not etched on a celluloid film strip, but carried in the hearts of his children. The boy who never had a hometown, the teenager who drifted through the Great Depression, finally built a permanent home. He created his own village. He patched the broken pieces of his history together with the golden thread of time, patience, and enduring love. It is not a perfect, sanitized Hollywood ending, but it is something infinitely better. It is a real, deeply human triumph. He had successfully navigated the turbulent waters of his personal life, finding a quiet, beautiful harbor in his 90s. He had his children. He had his grandchildren. He had his beloved ranch in Carmel, California, where the Pacific Ocean crashes against the ancient rocks. He was finally at peace with the world he had created. But as the ultimate lone wolf finally learned how to run with a pack, a different kind of quiet devastation was slowly creeping into his life. He had successfully outlasted his critics, outlasted the studio system, and outlasted the demons of his own past. But as he looked around the magnificent summit of the mountain he had climbed, the air was growing incredibly thin. He began to realize the terrifying, agonizing mathematical reality of living to be 95 years old. The man who had spent a lifetime surviving was about to face the heaviest, most unavoidable burden of longevity. He was about to discover what it truly costs when you are the only one left. The stage was set, the lights were dimming, and the ghosts of his generation were waiting in the wings. The long sunset, and the ghost appears. There is a romanticized, deeply comforting illusion we hold about the concept of a long life. We view extreme old age as the ultimate victory. We believe that to outlast the clock is to win the game, imagining that the final decades are a quiet, peaceful reward for having survived the turbulent storms of youth. But the stark, unvarnished mathematics of longevity carry a hidden, devastating tax. When you live to be 80, then 90, and then steadily march toward 95 years old, you do not just outlive your struggles. You outlive your era. You outlive the very context of your own existence. For Clint Eastwood, a man who spent his entire cinematic life playing the ultimate lone wolf, this mathematical reality slowly transformed from a fictional script into the heavy, inescapable truth of his everyday life. He had spent decades riding into the sunset, leaving other characters behind. But as the new millennium marched forward, the metaphor broke down. The lone wolf had reached the top of the mountain, only to look around and realize that the rest of the pack had completely vanished. To understand the profound, quiet isolation of Clint Eastwood in his twilight years, you must understand the sheer magnitude of the ghosts that surround him, the men and women who built the golden age of cinema alongside him, the peers who truly understood the smell of the old celluloid, the harsh glare of the vintage studio lights, and the specific, gritty rhythm of the 1960s and 1970s, began to take their final bows. Sergio Leone, the visionary Italian director who handed a young Clint a dirty poncho and cigar, transforming him into an immortal icon, crossed the great divide. Don Siegel, the legendary filmmaker who mentored him, shaped his directorial eye and handed him the .44 Magnum in Dirty Harry, faded into the archives of memory. Then came the agonizing, steady departure of his contemporaries. Iconic figures like Burt Reynolds, Sean Connery, and an entire generation of leading men who had shared the same magazine covers, competed for the same roles, and understood the exact same crushing weight of global fame. One by one, the lights went out. The vibrant, chaotic, fiercely competitive brotherhood of 20th century Hollywood slowly went silent. When you live long enough, the most mundane rituals of life become heavy with sorrow. Your address book gradually transforms from a directory of friends into a ledger of ghosts. The phone rings less frequently, not because people do not care, but because the people who shared your specific memories are no longer there to dial the number. You find yourself putting on a tailored, dark suit, not to walk a red carpet to receive an award, but to sit in the front row of yet another quiet church, listening to eulogy for a friend, watching another piece of your own history be lowered into the earth. You become an incredibly beautiful, towering redwood tree, standing alone in a forest that has been completely cleared. It is a specific kind of freezing, absolute isolation. When Clint sits in a room today, surrounded by young, brilliant, eager actors and executives, they look at him with absolute reverence. They treat him like a monument, but they cannot truly converse with him about the world he came from, because they were not born when he was already conquering it. He is a living bridge to an entirely vanished civilization. There is no one left to reminisce with. There is no one left who remembers what the water felt like before the bridge was built. Faced with this terrifying, overwhelming silence, most men of his immense wealth and historical stature would have simply surrendered. They would have retreated to a heavily guarded estate, sat on a porch overlooking a private golf course, and allowed the twilight to quietly wash over them. They would have accepted their status as a retired legend. But Clint Eastwood is not cut from the fabric of surrender. Instead of retreating into the silence, he went back to work. As he crossed into his 80s and remarkably into his 90s, the frequency of his filmmaking did not slow down. In many ways, it seemed to accelerate. He directed and starred in Gran Torino at 78. He carried the emotional weight of the mule at 88. He climbed back onto a horse in Cry Macho at 91. And at 94, he was back in the director's chair for Juror Number 2. The media, always eager for a simplistic narrative, marveled at his ambition. They called him a workaholic. They praised his relentless drive for box office success and Oscar gold. But the media completely misunderstood the underlying mechanism of his endurance. At 95 years old, Clint Eastwood is not chasing money. He has more wealth than several generations of his family could ever spend. He is not chasing awards. His shelves have been overflowing with golden statues for decades. He is not chasing fame. His face is already carved into the Mount Rushmore of global culture. So, why does a man with a fragile, aging body refuse to put down the camera? Why does he subject himself to the grueling, exhausting 12-hour days of a Hollywood film set when he could be resting? Because the director's chair is his final, absolute defense against the dark. The movie set is the only place on earth where the ghost cannot reach him. When he steps onto a soundstage, he is no longer the last surviving man of a forgotten era. He is the master of the universe. The set provides an immaculate, deeply comforting structure. There is a script, there is a schedule, there is a crew of hundreds of people moving in perfect synchronization, waiting for his soft, whispered command. For a man who has lost so many of his peers, the rhythmic, demanding pulse of a film crew becomes a substitute for his own heartbeat. The act of creating art is the ultimate defiance against the relentless decay of time. If he stops working, the quiet of his massive house will become unbearably loud. If he sits still, the memories of the people he has lost will finally catch up to him. He keeps the cameras rolling because forward motion is the only way he knows how to survive. Just like the 21-year-old boy who found himself sinking in the freezing, dark waters of the Pacific Ocean after a horrific plane crash, the 95-year-old legend simply refuses to stop swimming. He knows the shore is getting closer, and he knows the journey is coming to an inevitable end, but he will not allow the water to pull him under while he still has breath in his lungs. There is a breathtaking, almost heartbreaking majesty in watching him work today. The physical toll of nearly a century of living is undeniable. His tall, imposing frame, once the terrifying silhouette of the American West, has bowed under the immense gravity of time. His steps are slower, measured, and careful. The gravelly voice that once barked iconic threats has softened into a gentle, raspy whisper. But watch his eyes. Look closely at the legendary Squint when he peers through the camera lens. The fire that was ignited in the dusty, transient towns of the Great Depression is still burning with an absolute, searing intensity. The body may have yielded to the merciless arithmetic of the calendar, but the artistic soul remains entirely unbroken, completely unconquered. He has transformed the act of aging into a profound work of art by refusing to hide his frailty, by placing his weathered, 90-something-year-old face on giant cinematic screens. He has forced the world to look at the beauty, the sadness, and the magnificent dignity of growing old. He is the ultimate survivor, but surviving means you must carry the memories of everyone who didn't. As the sun begins to set on the longest, most extraordinary career in the history of the moving image, Clint Eastwood finds himself standing on the very edge of the horizon he spent a lifetime chasing. He has gathered his children, he has built his empire, and he has outlasted his era. There are no more rivals to defeat. There are no more genres to conquer. There's only the quiet, beautiful coastline of Carmel, the gentle crash of the Pacific waves, and the ultimate, inescapable task of making peace with the final frame of his own magnificent movie. The final frame and the peaceful ocean. There's a small, impossibly beautiful stretch of coastline in California called Carmel-by-the-Sea. It is a place where ancient Monterey cypress trees twist beautifully into fog, and where the massive, relentless waves of the Pacific Ocean violently crash against the jagged rocks. It is a landscape that demands quiet respect. It is rugged, timeless, and completely indifferent to the frantic, artificial noise of the modern world. It is entirely fitting, perhaps even poetic, that this is a place Clint Eastwood chose as his ultimate sanctuary. Far away from the flashing lights of Los Angeles, far removed from the boardrooms of studio executives and the red carpets, he walked for over half a century. The 95-year-old legend lives a life of profound, deliberate quiet. He was once the mayor of this small town. He walked its streets not as a cinematic god, but as a neighbor. And today, within the sturdy, silent walls of his beloved ranch, the greatest surviving icon of the American West is finally allowing the sun to set. To look at Clint Eastwood at 95 years old is to witness a magnificent living monument. The physical realities of nearly a century on Earth cannot be hidden, and true to his nature, he makes absolutely no attempt to hide them. The towering 6'4" frame that once cast a terrifying shadow across the Spanish deserts has bowed under the immense, accumulated gravity of time. His steps are slow, measured, and careful. The massive hands that once gripped the handle of a .44 Magnum revolver now rest gently on the polished wood of cane, or move softly across the black and white keys of his piano in the twilight hours. In a culture that is utterly obsessed with youth, a culture that views aging as a defeat to be covered up and surgically erased, there is something incredibly radical, incredibly brave about the way Clint Eastwood wears his age. He wears his wrinkles like combat medals. He carries his frailty not with shame, but with the quiet, overwhelming dignity of a man who has absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. For 70 years, the world demanded that he be unbreakable. They paid billions of dollars to watch him be invincible, to watch him never flinch, never cry, and never show a single ounce of vulnerability. But the most beautiful victory of his long, staggering life is not the fact that he played the toughest man on earth. The most beautiful victory is that, in the end, he finally permitted himself to take the mask off. The ultimate lone wolf, the man who spent decades hiding his emotions behind a legendary squint and a raspy whisper, has allowed himself to become a gentle, deeply observant patriarch. He does not need to project danger anymore. His sheer survival is his absolute authority. When his children and grandchildren visit the ranch, filling the quiet rooms with laughter and chaotic, beautiful life, the old man does not retreat into the silence. He sits in the center of the room. He listens. He smiles a genuine, unburdened smile that reaches all the way to his eyes. The boy from the Great Depression, the kid who was dragged from town to town, constantly uprooted, constantly saying goodbye, has finally achieved the one thing he was searching for his entire life. He has built a home where nobody can ever force him to leave. The fortress he built to keep the world out has finally been transformed into a warm, open house that keeps his loved ones safely inside. There is a breathtaking, profound symmetry to the geography of his final chapter. Remember the 21-year-old boy from the first chapter of our story. Remember the young soldier plunging into the freezing, dark, turbulent waters of the Pacific Ocean after a horrific plane crash. Remember how he swam for hours through the kelp in the darkness, refusing to surrender to the cold, refusing to let the ocean swallow him whole. He fought the current with every ounce of his strength because he was desperate to find the shore. Today, at 95, he sits on the balcony of his home in Carmel, looking out at that very same Pacific Ocean. But the dynamic has completely changed. He is no longer fighting the water. He no longer has to swim against the massive, freezing swells of life, Hollywood, and human tragedy. The ocean is no longer his adversary. It is his neighbor. He can sit in the quiet of the morning, Listen to the rhythmic, eternal crashing of the waves against the rocks, and know that he survived the crossing. He beat the current. He made it to the shore, and he built a magnificent empire on the sand. As the final frame of his extraordinary life slowly comes into focus, the ghosts of his past, the friends he outlived, the directors who shaped him, the era of cinema that he buried, no longer haunt him. They keep him company. They exist in the wind that blows through the cypress trees and in the quiet, jazzy chord he plays on his piano when the house is empty. Clint Eastwood's legacy is not merely printed on celluloid film reels locked away in a Hollywood vault. His true legacy is a masterclass in human endurance. He taught us that true grit is not about how fast you can draw a weapon, but about how long you can stand your ground when the world tells you that you're too old, too slow, or too broken to continue. He taught us that it is never too late to ask for forgiveness, to gather your fractured family, and to learn how to be a father. He showed us that a man can be forged in the dust of poverty, rejected by the glittering elites, and still rise to become the absolute master of his own destiny. He is the man with no name who made sure the world would never forget his. He is the Maestro of the shadows. He is the last great American cowboy. And as he watches the sun dip below the magnificent California horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of gold and crimson, he can finally, truly rest. The work is done. The masterpiece is finished. And the ending is absolutely, unequivocally perfect. As the screen fades to black on the magnificent, unparalleled journey of Clint Eastwood, the camera turns away from the Hollywood legend and it focuses on you. Clint's story is a profound reminder that we all wear masks to survive the difficult winters of our lives. We all build armor to protect ourselves from the rejections, the heartbreaks, and the turbulent oceans we are forced to swim across. But his story also holds a beautiful promise. If we live long enough, and if we are brave enough, there comes a day when we can finally lay the heavy armor down. What about you? As you look back on the long, winding road of your own life, what mask did you have to wear to survive? What challenges forced you to swim against the freezing current when you felt like giving up? And now, as the years have given you a profound gift of wisdom, who are the people that fill your house with light? What brings you the most peace when you look out at your own horizon? Please, do not let your story go untold. Share your journey, your memories, and your hard-earned wisdom in the comments below. This community is a gathering place for survivors, for those who have weathered the storms and found the shore. Your words might be exactly the beacon of light someone else needs to read today. If Clint Eastwood's legendary life moved you, if it reminded you of the absolute beauty of resilience and the quiet dignity of growing older, please leave a like on this video. Share it with a friend, a father, or anyone who needs to be reminded that the best chapters of our lives are often the quietest ones. Subscribe to our channel, because we are committed to telling the deep, unfiltered, and profoundly human stories behind the legends we thought we knew. Thank you, deeply and truly, for spending this time with us today. Remember that no matter how dark the water gets, you must never stop swimming. Keep your head above the waves. Cherish the people standing on the shore, and until we meet again, may your own sunset be as beautiful and as peaceful as you deserve.